So the question is that what's going on with Crohn's disease? So I started to think about it a little bit. This model would say that where you need to study, where you need the biopsies, where you need the patients, and what you need to model in the laboratory is right there. That's the site of the action for an acute gastroenteritis. But what happens if you have an intracellular pathogen? Well, it turns out that for intracellular pathogens, whether they are salmonella, the cause of typhoid, listeria, the cause of listeriosis, mycobacteria, they generally invade without causing pathology. Nobody knows the day they got the listeria, right? They had listeriosis weeks later, sometimes 60 days later after eating the bad meat. Same thing with tuberculosis. I can cough on you and give you TB today. You're not going to have symptoms now. You might have symptoms years from now. Intracellular pathogens do not cause acute inflammation when they go in. They have an amazing ability to sneak into the host without causing disease. So, with an intracellular organism, what you'd have is you'd have invasion without pathology, you'd have spread through your lymphatics, and you would end up with a resident infection underneath the surface in the lymph nodes. In that model, eventually you would have a chronic inflammation that would lead to obstruction. It would be like a dam, like when Quebec Hydro dammed all the rivers up north and then they started to flow backwards towards the James Bay. And in that case, the ulcer that we think of in Crohn's disease is not what happened at the beginning. It's not the cause of the disease, but it's the consequence of the disease. And only at that point would you present for a research study and have a biopsy, or at that point you would have some sort of a study done. So then if you take this and look at it and say what's wrong here, you may not know what's initiating the process. It'll describe what's going on today, but it doesn't necessarily mean what you're seeing is the start of the process. It could be the end of the process. So in an inside-out model, then these ulcers would attract bacteria, so you'd end up with bacteria on the surface, sort of like Velcro. But those bacteria may or may not be the cause of Crohn's disease. They may be a secondary phenomenon. And in that case, what I believe, but I may be totally wrong, is that the place where you would want to investigate for an organism that could be the cause of Crohn's disease would be down there. I don't think the mesenteric lymph nodes in this model are reactive and secondary to the disease. I think they could actually be the primary reservoir, or the foyer, if you like, in French, of the disease. Now, you will note that there's actually no data here, right? This is just things that I made up. So I sent this into the journal Inflammatory Bowel Diseases solely as an exercise in thinking, as a thought exercise. So don't walk out of this room and say, we now know the cause of Crohn's disease. This is just an alternative view of it. But in this situation, you'd say, well, how alternative is this guy? Is this guy really all that original? And so I sent that in, and I was really excited. It got accepted, and it got published. And then I was flipping through some of those files that you have on your desk. Does anybody here have a doctor who has like a lot of articles on their desk that are piling up? So I sort of looked at it, and I thought, gee, I should flip back to some of the original articles. This guy named Burl Crohn wrote an article in 1932. And what he said is that the submucosa, so that's below the surface, is the seat of the marked inflammatory changes. And as a result of these, the wall of the bowel becomes thickened. And I was like, oh, I should have cited him. I can't believe I stole his idea. And I sent this idea, a bright new idea, to a surgeon in Montreal, and I said, what do you think of this new model? You think we should study lymph nodes? He's like, that sounds like my Boyd's textbook of surgical pathology. I'm like, what? So we dusted off his 1967 Boyd's textbook of surgical pathology, and in it, it was said, it has been suggested that mesenteric lymphatic obstruction plays a part in that infection may enter the intestinal lymphatics at the ileocecal angle, causing on the one hand a mesenteric lymph node inflammation, and on the other hand edema and granuloma formation in the wall of the bowel. So now I felt like I was almost guilty of plagiarism, because all this work and all this thought and all this writing, and it turned out that other people had said the same thing 40 and 70 years before me. So my question is not whether I'm original. We've now disproven that. The question is, am I right? is this model relevant? Is this pertinent, or is this just total fiction? And I don't know at this point, right? And those of you who have Crohn's disease are willing to tell me that when you have an ulcer in your ileum, you don't actually know if the ulcer is the start or the end of your ileal process. And I acknowledge that, and I'm willing to admit that nobody really has a good feel for what happens in their ileum. However, for those of you who have abscess ulcers in your mouth, and some of you may, and I've heard of this from others, you'll be able to tell me, do these start as a little hole in your mouth and then later on you get pain and you get a little bump under there? Or is it the kind of thing that you feel some pain and you feel a bump under the surface that you can feel with your tongue, and you say, something's coming on, and after 3 or 4 days, the ulcer appears? And I've heard people describe one of those two options, but I'm going to leave that to you. But maybe some of you have an opinion on that. And the same could even apply for perianal disease. For those of you who have suffered from perianal disease, do you feel that there's some sort of a raw mucosa with an ulcer that then leads to the fissure or the abscess? Or rather, can it be that for a few days or even a week you feel pain, something under the surface, and then it releases and you see the ulcer coming out as a secondary event? This has also been studied post-surgically, and people who followed the recurrence of disease after surgery have described in the early 90s that there may be inflammation under the surface before you see the ulcer coming out. So I'm just proposing the model. It's the same week as the Iceland volcano. It's not quite a volcano, but the same idea that the heat may be under the surface and the volcano may be the manifestation of it, rather than the volcano being the start of the process. So I'll be willing to accept questions either in front of the entire room or even just at the side afterwards about whether you think my model is correct. We have already conclusively shown that it's not original. So, my concluding thoughts. And I may be wrong, I do not consider that there's direct evidence that Crohn's is an autoimmune disease, and I'm not convinced that calling it an autoimmune disease is helping the agenda of understanding the cause. I believe that an immune deficiency paradigm fits better with some of the data. It's consistent with analogy, it's consistent with immunology, and it's consistent with the genetic data. Which bacteria might be implicated? And some of you are already saying, well, he told us about one bacteria, but it could be another bacteria. And then other people are saying, what about a combination? I'm still willing to accept that it's much more complicated than that. I just presented evidence for one bacterium, but there could be other bacteria, and there could even be combinations of bacteria. That's a field that I believe requires active investigation. And just when you've got a model that really works, you say, well, there's some really interesting data about mycobacteria, but there's also some real holes in the mycobacterial theory. You could talk to your gastroenterologist and say, oh, it's Crohn's mycobacterial infection. They say, no, wait. You say, why? Well, because there's missing information. I told you that people have found DNA from mycobacteria and looked under the microscope and seen them, but very few people have grown this organism out of Crohn's biopsies. So why? Why is that? You know, if it's really the cause of Crohn's disease, somebody should find it and should grow it like every other infectious disease. So you have to be very careful when you have selective information in favor of a hypothesis. You tend to forget about the information that is against that hypothesis. And then, accepting that mutations in NOD2 and autophagy predispose to Crohn's disease, we're still left with that question, like how? How exactly does that happen? What happens between impaired innate immunity today and chronic inflammation at age 15 or 20 or 25? You've got these genetic mutations at birth. What happened during those decades that you were well, and what was the trigger that led to the inflammatory process? And if you have this innate immune defect, why do you get a gut disease? Why don't you get a lung disease? Why don't you get a skin disease? Why don't you get a kidney disease? What is it about these defects that guides us to one anatomic site instead of others? And these are still, I think, critical deficiencies that have to be addressed.